Yeah. So she's talking about the hunger strikes in Virginia and Ohio. I hadn't heard about either one of those. I live in California, so I had certainly heard about the Pelican Bay strikes, but just organizing that's happening within the prisons. We're good. Great. So welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here this morning. This is the Combating Criminal Justice Violations panel. We are going to be using the hashtag NN12CJ for this panel. So if you're tweeting, which we hope you are, please use that hashtag. And also, if you're tweeting, I'm going to do a very short introduction of our guests right now, just so you have their Twitter handles, and we'll go into greater depth in a moment. To my immediate right is Kamau Franklin of the Malcolm X grassroots movement, who is going to tell you where he blogs, and that's going to be where you can find him online. To his right is Matt Nelson from Color of Change, and you can follow Color of Change at Color of Change. And to Matt's right is Dana Kaplan from the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana, who tweets at Dana K. Nola. Great, and I'm Dani McClain, and I'm Campaigns and Media Director at colorofchange.org, which is the nation's largest online Black political organization. And for those of you who don't know us, we're an online community of more than 800,000 people around the country who use the power of the internet to make government and corporations more accountable to Black Americans and our allies. So you're here today because you care about criminal justice issues and you want to know how to leverage technology to build successful campaigns. And so because you care about these things, you already know that the past year has shown signs of progress in criminal justice reform, along with some pretty devastating defeats. In April, just a couple of months ago, Connecticut became the 17th state in the country and the 5th in 5 years to eliminate capital punishment. Yeah. Yeah. And New York State, some exciting news out of New York. The New York State could be, it looks like it is on the verge of some tremendous change as Governor Cuomo and a strong bipartisan coalition of legislators and advocates are calling for the passage of a law that could stop the NYPD's practice of making unlawful discriminatory marijuana arrests, right? Yeah. Very exciting work that's actually being led by our partners and colleagues at Drug Policy Alliance, and we have some great DPA folks in the room. But as you also know, we've had some pretty major losses as well. In September of last year, the state of Georgia executed Troy Davis, who had been on death row for more than 20 years. And as you know, his case was riddled with issues. Witnesses recanted, many witnesses recanted the testimony that helped put him behind bars, and many of the jurors who helped convict him expressed concerns prior to his execution and asked that the execution not proceed. Nonetheless, Georgia proceeded in September. And of course, we know that George Zimmerman evaded arrest for about 6 weeks after he killed 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, an unarmed teenager who was walking back to his father's house in Sanford, Florida, just outside of Orlando. But these same so-called stand your ground laws that Zimmerman's supporters have said should shield him from prosecution have done nothing to help Cece McDonald, the Black trans woman who was convicted on charges of second-degree manslaughter for killing the white man who attacked her and her friends. Nor has that law worked for Marissa Alexander, the Black woman who was recently sentenced to 20 years in prison for firing a warning shot against her abusive husband. So just some recent examples. We know this, but the way that racial disparities play out within the criminal justice system are very real. So one thing that many of these cases, both the victories and the setbacks, have in common is the use of social networks, blogs, and online organizing in getting the word out and raising public awareness around these issues. So we saw hundreds of thousands of people calling on the Georgia Board of Parole to grant clemency to Troy Davis. We saw the too much doubt hashtag on Twitter going all around as people took to social networks to raise awareness of his situation, even as mainstream and corporate media remained silent up until, for much of the campaign work that was done to try to save his life. We saw more than 1 million people sign online petitions calling on a just resolution after the killing of Trayvon Martin. We saw people using Twitter and Facebook. We saw people taking photographs of themselves wearing hoodies and saying, "Am I suspicious?" and posting those to their Facebook profiles. And we know all about the use of online tactics that turn people out to nationwide vigils and marches. But we're very lucky today because we have this panel of very experienced and inspiring activists and advocates who are going to help us think about how to better use digital media and technology to take full advantage of these organizing moments and put them at the service of building a real movement. And so I'm going to let you know who we have with us today. So Kamau Franklin has worked as a community activist for more than 15 years in New York City and is now based in the South. In addition to his work as an activist attorney, he is a leading member of the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, an organization dedicated to human rights advocacy and building grassroots institutions in the Black community. MXGM works on various issues including youth development, fighting police misconduct, and creating sustainable urban communities. Kamau has helped develop community cop watch programs, freedom school programs for youth, and alternatives to incarceration programs. He's written articles for various online publications, including Black Agenda Report, Left Turn, ThyBlackMan.com, and Organizing Upgrade. He's a featured writer in the upcoming book, A Lie of Reinvention, Correcting Manning Marable's Malcolm X. He writes regularly at his blog, KamauFranklin.wordpress.com, and he is married to Aget Betru. We also have with us today Matt Nelson, my colleague. I'm very honored to work alongside Matt Nelson at Color of Change. Matt's our senior campaign manager at Color of Change, which is the largest Black American online political organization in the country. As a campaign strategist, organizer, and communications expert, Matt has led dozens of community anti-oppression efforts and has trained and mentored hundreds of community leaders and organizers around the country. As a social justice entrepreneur, Matt has started 4 successful small businesses promoting alternative economic structures, including the first fair trade, worker-owned collective cafe in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. He currently serves on the board of the Progressive Communicators Network and the Bay Area chapter of the National Lawyers Guild. And Dana Kaplan. Dana is the executive director of the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana. Prior to coming to JJPL, Dana Kaplan was a Soros Justice Fellow at the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York City. At CCR, Dana worked with community groups and government on developing alternatives to detention and downsizing local jails. She was also an organizer for a partnership between CCR and 2 prison family organizations that reduced the cost of all phone calls from New York State prisons by 50%. It's huge. Ms. Kaplan, Dana, has been on staff at the Brooklyn-based Prison Moratorium Project, where she helped stop the construction of a youth prison upstate and 2 youth jail expansions in New York City. Dana holds a master's degree from the City University of New York and a BA from UC Berkeley, where she graduated Phi Beta Kappa and was a recipient of the John Gardner Fellowship for Public Service. And thank you all for being with us today. I'm very sorry to have to let you all know that Laura Moy is not going to be able to make it. She's here at the conference, but she woke up sick today. So many of you know Laura's work with Amnesty International. She led much of their work trying to stop the execution of Troy Davis. So we're going to get started, and I want to turn it over to Kamau.
Okay. How's everybody doing? Just good? Good. All right. So I want to thank Netroots and Color of Change, I think, who sponsored this panel, for asking me to be on it or be a panelist on it. When they said it was about criminal justice issues and police misconduct and those kind of things, of course, I jumped at the chance because that's what I do on a regular basis, both as an attorney and as an activist. And then when they mentioned it was featuring the work on social media and how you use social media, I was like, It's like me? I was like, okay, we can toy with that a little bit. And what I mean by that is that I'm probably at the age where my activism started a little bit before social media really took off. And so me, and I would say the organization I've been a part of, has always been a little late in sort of catching the wave of social media. But part of my discussion is going to include ways in which we have used, obviously, social media for our benefit, but also some ways in which some ideas, I think, which are currently being used in police reform and misconduct in New York City, which I think are really good and inspiring and are based in social media activism. So we've been organizing around the issue of police brutality as the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement. We're a national organization, but particularly our New York chapter has been organizing around the issue of police brutality for somewhere between 12 or 15 years. Actually, we started before 9/11, and I mention that because right now we seem to be at a period where police misconduct or the issue of stop and frisk has really started to take hold in the media in general, and people are discussing ways to change it. We had a similar period, not exactly what we're experiencing now, but a similar period pre-9/11 where I will say mainstream media, corporate media, really started talking about the issue of police misconduct and police brutality. And then post 9/11, the issue of dealing with police and their activities in communities of color, particularly black neighborhoods in New York City, sort of fell off the map. And you could not get corporate media to say anything that would be, relatively speaking, negative about policing in the city. In any incident, and they still do this today, of course, but any incident that takes place gets put out there as sort of a bad apple syndrome. So anything that was talking about the racialized policing that takes place, that talks about sort of systematic discrimination against the black and brown communities in New York City and across the country, the over-policing, that was something that did not get covered in regular corporate media, and something that post 9/11 for a while stayed dormant. And it wasn't until social media, the internet, through everything from emailing to Facebook, picked this up as an issue. And I'm not sure if there's any one organization that can take credit for it, but there's a hodgepodge of different groups in New York City, in particular from, I would say, larger and well-established organizations like the Center for Constitutional Rights, New York Civil Liberties Union, to smaller organizations like ours as the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, National Congress of Puerto Rican Rights, CAB, and several other organizations which have done work on these issues also. Also, the killing of Sean Bell, even though there was no real justice that came out of it in terms of the court system, led to heightened activity in terms of social media. There was large campaigns around people changing, of course, their Facebook pages to like a bullet that represented Sean Bell being killed. There were stats that began to be put out all over the place around the over 500,000 people who are stopped every year in New York City in terms of stop and frisk activities. So this kind of stuff started building momentum, and now we're at this point now where we have potentially the changes that's going to come around the marijuana law, but also organizations and foundations which are taking now an active interest in combating police misconduct and police brutality. And one of the things that they're using, or one of the tools that are being used, is called the Cop Watch program. And it's, for those who came in late, maybe they didn't get a copy of the program, a copy of the handout I have, but I have a handout here that's called a Cop Watch brochure, and it's sitting there in that front seat if anybody wants to grab one while I'm speaking. So don't get nervous. It says confidential. This is an old one. This is probably the first handbook we created in terms of doing a Cop Watch. And if anybody's familiar with the origins of a Cop Watch program, it comes out of the 1960s of the Black Panther Party in Oakland, California, challenging police brutality. So we updated it for New York City. You know, we use cameras, not guns, ha ha ha, to watch the police in our community to make sure that the police are behaving themselves. And over the years, what we've done with that information is that we've created videos, streamed it over the internet. We started campaigns when our own members were arrested based on the Cop Watch programs that they were doing. And we actually sort of led a campaign that after 3 members were arrested doing a Cop Watch and charged with everything from assaulting a police officer to resisting arrest to obstruction of governmental administration, we led a campaign that was both street level and social media that led to all charges being dropped against them and led to a lawsuit being settled on in favor on their behalf. So in that way, social media has been useful for us. And when you look, if people look in this pamphlet, one of the other ways in which we've used social media, or at least the internet, at the time, if you look at page 3 and page 4, one of the great uses of social media, and or the internet, I should say, is that we were able to get information ourselves that prior we would not have access to, right? So here, the communities that we do Cop Watch programs in are in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights in Brooklyn, New York. And again, this is an old program, so these commanding officers who you see here are no longer there. But the rest of the information here is, for the most part, accurate. We were able to get the boundaries for the precincts. We were able to obviously get their locations, maps, where the precincts are located. And this kind of stuff for us became useful in terms of designing our Cop Watch program, because it let us know exactly what neighborhoods it is that we wanted to patrol, what were the precincts in those neighborhoods, that kind of thing. So that's something that also became useful for us as an organization. I was going to also talk a little bit about, I guess, how social media, I guess a little bit about how we've been behind the curve in social media in terms of getting the word out or the message out. But recently, I think the New York City Liberties Union just put out an app that allows people to track stop and frisk in New York City, which is going to be a great piece of information for those who are in New York, and maybe something that can be duplicated across the country. It's something that allows people to actually, I think, document by filming on your phone if you see illegal activity taking place in the streets. Something that people, of course, have already had access to, but this allows you to immediately upload it to a website which can be viewed and looked at and documented about where these stops are taking place. So this is another tool. You know that there's the CCRB, the Civilian Complaint Review Board, of course, documents stop and frisk and police misconduct. But this type of information has never been so out there publicly, where anybody can look at where stop and frisks are taking place, like what communities. I think the application also gives you an opportunity to actually see potentially where some programs, where some things are hot and heavy. So you can see where the police are focusing in on stop and frisk, and for some people that may be a reason to avoid those areas, right? For other folks who want to document police misconduct or police brutality, it may be an opportunity to go to those communities and to actually, do a cop watch what's going on, make sure that there's a presence, right? So in that way, we think the social media aspect has been really, really good. How I say that it hasn't been that kind to us is that, like Al Gore, who took credit for the internet, I'm going to take a little credit for the app, at least in my own mind. How it hasn't been kind for us is that several years ago, we wanted to do something called a New York City Radar Cop website, which, if anybody here is a good blogger or a good internet or computer person, let me know. We can talk later. But the idea of it was to also document police misconduct and brutality, and to have people actually go online and put up their stories of how they've been stopped by the police. And that included everything from what particular incident happened to them, to whether or not they were beaten up, falsely arrested, cursed at, what was their sentence, or what was their, when's their next court date if they wanted to get support. If they had information on the police officer, they could put up the name of the police officer. They could put up the precinct that the police officer is from. If they had access to the badge number, they could put up the badge number. So all this stuff is things that we wanted to do. But where we sort of dropped off was that we made 3 attempts with folks to put the site up, but unfortunately the site never, the kinks and or what was necessary to get the site up never worked for us. And some of that had to do with our own experience and or lack of experience, right, with using this technology. Some of it had to do with us being a small organization, and so not having the funding necessary to keep something like this going. And so sometimes one of the things that can be a challenge for organizations who don't either have funding or like us that are volunteer driven for the most part is that you have to sort of pick and choose how well you can use this technology. If you have staff, and staff can be there all day to not only put new information up, but to monitor that information, to make sure that information is being turned to something that's useful, like a report or something that can be put out to the public, then that's something that it could really be helpful for. But for smaller organizations, there are probably some disadvantages that we may have. That still makes the technology useful for us, of course, but it means for us it may not be our the lead way in which we interact in terms of using this technology. Lastly, I'll say, even though I think all of us agree that the internet and social media is a great tool, for organizers and activists, obviously the best tool is to always make sure that you're going to be out there in the streets, right? Because you can never really organize either a community or against a particular issue just by blogging or by putting something up on Facebook, right? So it's probably a tried and true. I think the conversation about social media being useful or not useful in terms of activism is a dead one at this stage, because I think it's been shown to be a very useful tool. But we should always make sure that it's not an exclusive tool to our organizing and activism, that the work that has to be done a lot of times face-to-face and has to be done in the street. So it's something just to keep in mind, and thank you guys for letting me present.
Thank you. Thank you, Kamau. Next, we have Matt Nelson, Senior Campaign Manager at Color of Change. Sure.
How's it going, everybody? You having a good time at Netroots Nation time? You doing all right? So I want to thank first everyone for being here. I think that these type of issues, we really need all of us. We really need all of our best thinking, our best technology, our best organizing. And for anyone that's worked on these type of issues, you know firsthand that it takes a lot. You know, it takes a lot of heart. It takes a lot of courage. It takes a lot of tapping into what we really care about, and tapping into how we can actually fight for dignity. Some of these big issues around people's fundamental rights and dignity, safety, you know, these things are ways in which that I know touches a lot of people very closely. And I think that in addition to unaccountable, out of control corporate power, the out of control criminal justice system is one of the fundamental threats to our democracy. And I think that we've steadily seen that become more and more of a role in everyday life. Pretty much everyone I know has somebody who's been caught up in the criminal justice system in some unfair way. And if we want to talk about a new way forward for this country, we have to deeply engage in this criminal justice system that incarcerates so many, so often, and at the same time, make sure that so many people are blind to the damage that it's doing, that it's maybe working for some, but not for others. And I see it in every major city in this country. You know, there's not just one New Orleans, there's 2 or 3 different New Orleans. There's not just one Milwaukee, there's 3 or 4 different Milwaukees. And you can name any city that you know. And part of how it breaks down is how your everyday interaction with law enforcement, with the criminal justice system, is different. And for the most part, for people of color, the interactions can go from benign to dangerous instantly. And I think setting a little bit of that context and understanding that oftentimes when we address issues of police brutality, prisons, of people being caught up, we're in this triumph for tragedy. And usually they come together. And I want us to think about our campaigns in ways that we don't get just in this triumph for tragedy situation all the time. Like somebody gets killed by the police. It's a tragedy. We try to organize. Maybe we get, if we win a campaign, maybe we get a fair hearing or some reprimand. but we're still in this situation of holding both of that, of holding the tragedy even in campaign victories. So I'm going to talk about two particular campaigns that I think lay out a couple different strategies. The first one I'll talk about is Cook County, Illinois. The Cook County 10, around about 20 years ago, there was a murder, a brutal murder and rape in Cook County, Illinois. And you know, sadly, instead of doing like good police work and investigation, actually solve the crime, the law enforcement rounded up a number of black youth and forced them to confess to these crimes and then incarcerated them. And they were known as the Cook County 10. The boys ranged in age from 14 to 17. And you know, they spent years and years and years in prison. Later, DNA evidence basically showed that there was no basis for their arrest or incarceration other than a forced confession. And so we, Color of Change, worked with the Innocence Project and the Center of Wrongful, but around some fundamental problems with law enforcement when, like, police work means you force somebody to confess. Police work means you sort of go after what is perceived as a criminal, which in this case, and in many cases, was young black youth. And, you know, through the campaign, not only were the Cook County 10 exonerated, but from there, the state was forced to basically set up a ombuds commission to review the type of tactics that police used. So our goal in this was not just to sort of like show the innocence of these men, but was to have the county recognize fundamental flaws in how they did their law enforcement practice. At the end of the campaign, the state's attorney basically said, law enforcement is not just about prosecuting people, it's about recognizing mistakes that we make in this system. And how we're able to do that was a combination of a good online campaign with really solid offline organizing and an excellent legal strategy. And so with any campaign that I think is successful, we hit a handful of these different points of intervention. And I think that our Color of Change, you know, our online campaigns can really work when it's in sync with an ongoing organizing strategy. And that's what we saw. I think that some of the tools that we were able to use was we had quite a few folks sign a petition, over 65,000. And then from there, we had a pretty strong pool of people who we could go back to and ask to either the local folks to attend a rally, or we were able to go back and ask people to make phone calls to the state's attorney at really important points. And so the campaign just continued to grow, and it was I think not only successful in terms of the case, but successful in terms of creating an infrastructure by which we could do more positive work in the future. And, you know, a clear message to law enforcement that this practice that had been going on for 30 plus years of forcing confessions, you know, was really under a light now. The other one I'll quickly talk about is private prisons. And in Walnut Grove, Mississippi, the GEO group ran a really nasty, awful, brutal gulag of a prison, where essentially the people who were housed there were in many ways encouraged to fight, encouraged to really set a condition that was not livable. So we went directly at the state and the corporation, the GEO group, basically saying, you know, the GEO group shouldn't be allowed to operate a youth facility. Again, this was 13 to 23-year-olds. And the prison, essentially, a private prison for youth, has no incentive to rehabilitate anybody because they would lose paying customers. So there was fundamental flaws in the model of private prisons, and this was one of the worst cases of people really suffering at the hands of this type of for-profit, privatized incarceration. One of the tools we used was we had a petition, but we made it mobile ready, and then people in Mississippi, in Walnut Grove, actually went door to door like they would in any organizing campaign, but they did it with handheld phones. So they could go and knock, say, hey, this is what we're doing. Would you sign the petition? You can leave a comment. And I know folks are familiar with like open rates and click rates. Theirs were sort of off the chart. So because they were knocking on doors and asking people to do it. But the amazing thing about that is that the offline petition gathering outpaced the online by a little bit. And that was like pretty shocking to us. So even within the same time period. So in a week, the offline gathered the same amount as the online. And actually, in terms of building the list, at the end of this campaign, like our Mississippi list had increased about 30%. And you had families, the coalition of families and friends of folks incarcerated in the prison were leading this campaign. And then the Southern Poverty Law Center had an active lawsuit against the conditions. And so again, like we were able to go to the point of decision makers. We were able to have a legal strategy, have an offline strategy, and have an online strategy. And that's the type of multi-implication that I think we all have to deploy in these campaigns. And so, to make a long story shorter, the GEO Group was forced to out of business in Walnut Grove. The facility will shut down. And also, the GEO Group is now no longer allowed to have prisons in Mississippi. So they're leaving the state. And I think it identifies a vulnerability of private prisons. And so I think if we're able to sort of move the second largest prison corporation out of one state, we can do it to many states. I know there's a question around immigration rights. I know Wells Fargo invests in the GEO Group. You know, there's a lot of connections here. The GEO Group also operates a lot of the immigrant detention facilities, and they're vulnerable. And I think that it takes campaigns that have, that have this catapulting effect to sort of get to a point of when we win, we're in a good position to sort of have a different set of conditions that will then hopefully allow us to change a culture that won't allow for things like this to happen. Because, again, the panel is about combating some of these criminal justice violations, which is sort of the first step in really changing a culture that can hopefully allow for some sort of more just democracy. But we can't have that. We can't have, how can we have democracy when we have so much, so many people incarcerated? How can we have democracy when so many of our brothers and sisters are harassed every day by law enforcement? How can we have a democracy when so many people are branded with permanent criminal records that restricts opportunities? And I think that this challenge, has really become a challenge of the modern day we live in, a challenge of the 21st century, is truly making a different, changing the culture by which these things are totally unacceptable. And then we don't have to continue to organize within tragedy and hope for a handful of triumph here and there. And I guess I'll close with, I think there's some really exciting things happening next. I think that some of the tools and applications, and I think that people are really, from Trayvon Martin, from Troy Davis, a lot of innovation came. And I hope that we can apply this innovation in seeing For instance, seeing police accountability, cop watch work as part of our civic engagement work. I know that civic engagement is sort of talked about a lot, but why can't civic engagement be seen as like monitoring law enforcement? Because folks who go out and monitor law enforcement and hold them accountable are usually the same folks who are going to vote. They're the same folks who are going to call the city when trash isn't going to be picked up. They're the same folks who are going to really add to their neighborhoods and communities. And so that's why I'm hopeful for the Glick case coming around that will that'll establish that it is okay and legal to film police, but it should be seen as like this is part of our everyday civic engagement duties. And so when you wake up tomorrow, think about what am I doing to really change and improve this criminal justice system, because it is something we can do every day, because it's something that impacts us every day. So with that, I am excited to hear your questions and get more deep into this. Thank you.
Thanks, Matt. Next up, we have Dana Kaplan from the Juvenile Justice Project of Louisiana.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. I will try to be somewhat expeditious so that we have time for our Q&A. But I guess I'll start just by saying that, certainly as the man in the front said when we started this, there has been an increased amount of attention on criminal justice issues, which is very, very inspiring to see as someone who has been working on this for probably the last, 15 years, I'd say, when it seemed like there was no real recognition of the inequalities and injustices of the criminal justice system, and in particular, its impact on communities of color. So the fact, I will say that in Louisiana, we had an 8-day series on incarcerated Louisiana was pretty significant. Now, there's a huge disconnect still, or a huge road to travel between an increased focus on an issue and actually being able to make concrete policy changes and concrete reforms happen, particularly when the interests are so vested like they are in the criminal justice system. So I'm going to just talk pretty quickly about, I'll be honest, my definition of pretty quickly when I talk sometimes doesn't align. But I'm going to try to talk pretty quickly about one campaign that we did in New Orleans in the wake of the hurricane, as we tried to basically fight to rebuild the city with a more just criminal justice system. And it was in particular around the rebuilding of Orleans Parish Prison, or New Orleans Jail. So just really briefly, some quick facts. People here in this room are probably familiar with the fact that the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. Louisiana has the very dubious distinction of leading the pack in terms of having the highest incarceration rate in the country, well above the national average. Pre-Katrina, Orleans Parish Prison, or OPP, had 7,200 beds, or basically one bed for every 65 residents. So just to give a little bit of a comparison there, if we had a jail detention size, or a jail detention rate that was a national average, we'd have an 850-bed jail. So obviously 7,000 people in jail is a pretty big difference. It's an incredibly violent facility, at least 8 deaths in the last year. That number has actually gone up since I've done this PowerPoint a few months ago. So, it's really probably once a month that we hear of someone dying in that facility. And the cost of the city of New Orleans is absolutely huge. So $22.39 is the per diem that our sheriff gets for housing local prisoners, and it costs the city about $27 million. So this was just the goal that a coalition in Orleans came together around to ensure that the recovery of New Orleans from Hurricane Katrina was rebuilt we rebuilt a more just criminal justice system. So that is just the some of the organizations that were involved in the Orleans Parish Prison Reform Coalition. So it was a pretty broad effort. And I would say that is probably one of my main points in terms of how you can actually get some reform wins, is the link between the grassroots organizations, a lot of membership organizations, primarily communities of color, that were directly impacted by the system, working with good government advocates, faith leaders, and members of the business community and fiscal conservatives. And that's the message that I want to hit on in terms of where we were able to make some strong media messages in particular, because I know that was a question that someone had. So our campaign came about when, in fall of 2010, our Sheriff Gussman, sought approval for a new facility of 5,800 beds. And so one of the first things that we said was this was in a context of a lot of debate about how we should be rebuilding our city. So when the sheriff went to the city council with a proposal for 5,800 beds, we as a coalition really wanted to talk not just about why that was a bad idea, but we really wanted to make an issue of what was the trade-off. If the city was going to spend $27 million on a new jail, what would it mean for other aspects of the city? And so one thing that we did as a public education tool is we asked residents of New Orleans to donate $22.39, or the cost of one day in jail, and help us give us $22.39, but please also tell us what you would like to see $22.39 of taxpayer dollars spent on rather than incarceration. And we ended up in just about a week getting inundated with hundreds and hundreds of people who sent us in checks for $22.39. We got a check from the Angola 3, actually. They literally sent us a check for $22.39. We got a few people who said, we're contributing 4 days, we're contributing 10 days. And it came from residents from uptown New Orleans, from the 9th Ward. It also came from a number of cast and crew members of HBO's Treme. We got a number of jazz musicians who sent us in funds, former elected officials, former judges, former city council members. It was really, really a diverse group of people that sent in their $22 that they wanted to see that money spent on was also huge. Housing, education, employment, drug treatment, mental health, rebuilding the 9th Ward. People got very, very specific. They were like, there is a pothole on Tchoupitoulas and 3rd Street, and I need to get it fixed. And then, you know, the pothole on Tchoupitoulas and 3rd Street made it into the newspaper as we had this giant ad. That was too big to fit in a PowerPoint, by the way, so I realized that we're missing a visual component to this. But it was really, really impressive. And at the bottom of that ad, of course, it had the phone numbers for all of our city council members and asked people to call and said, turn down this proposal from the sheriff. The other thing that we did was we worked with the Color of Change, which might be how I ended up on this panel. And as a number of local organizations based out of New Orleans, we had a lot of effective ground game going on, and we were able to use the media tools that we had. We didn't have the access to the whole technology that Color of Change had. We also didn't have the full list that Color of Change had developed, in particular around their work on the Gina 6 in Louisiana. And so in partnership with Color of Change, we sent out an action alert and got over 400, I think in the end it was much higher than that, actually, emails in less than a week to the City Council and the Mayor of New Orleans. And the one thing I would say to that is that certainly I would say, I think as Matt said earlier, that there's a real strength in the partnership there of the national kind of online organizing initiative, really partnering with a lot of local groups and bringing those tools together. So in the end, we got a unanimous city council vote for a 1,438-bed jail, which is a huge reduction from 7,200 beds. So we still wanted it more aligned with the national average, but we're still hearing from one of our council members with just, I won't read the whole thing, but demonstrated significantly how impressive the power of the civic engagement was, the activism, the online organizing, the traditional media, all aspects of it, and the diverse messengers that we had from the business community saying, we just can't afford this, to a lot of formerly incarcerated folks who went up and testified at City Council and said, this system is destroying our lives quite literally, and at the trade-off of all other social services. And the final thing that I'll just say is, we've now, since we got that pretty great win in, have been working to ensure that it's fully implemented. and also working to try to end the per diem system. So as we've continued our work, we've been continuing to use billboards with y'all, which is a funder gave us some funds to have a billboard pretty significantly in the middle of New Orleans, right near the Superdome. And I don't know that you can quite read it from there, but some of the things it says is stop jailing people to make money, end the per diem system. Fact, New Orleans is the only major U.S. city funding its jail in a per diem system. Look at other cities using cost-effective public safety practices, listen to the experts, take action, and the time for change is now. Smaller jail equals housing, jobs, mental health, reinvest in real safety. And so that's the final piece. I would say in terms of the messages, absolutely, talking about the human costs and the fiscal costs, talking about the trade-offs, particularly as states and local municipalities are facing such significant shortfalls. There's a real opportunity in criminal justice reform. And the final thing that I'll say is also in recognition of the point about how there's, the question about how there's been unity between black and brown communities and the issue of immigrant detention. We actually, in particular, because New Orleans has a growing immigrant population, we've really actually tried to be really intentional about forming that bridge. And just yesterday in New Orleans, actually, members of Orleans Parish Prison Reform Coalition worked with the Worker Center for Racial Justice, which is an immigrants' rights organization, to do an action that started at ICE around stopping the deportations of 32 labor organizers, and then went to Orleans Parish Prison around the fact that there have been so many deaths in the facilities. So I think there is absolutely both a need and opportunity for greater unity among progressive communities across the board, but also in particular black and brown communities and communities of color on this issue. So hopefully that was not as quick as...
Thank you, Dana. So we are ready to open it up for questions. Yeah, let's start right back here.